Today we are blessed to have one of Colorado's best-known performance poets, SETH. He admits openly to having a sordid love affair with language. In his poetic memoir, which he has both books on the back table there, A Black Odyssey, his language runs the gamut from the vernacular to the Elizabethan. In his satirical novel, The Perfect Stranger, his lyrical wordplay knows few limits. A veritable love fest of language. Yay! Let's welcome Seth Harris.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm mainly here to talk about my new book, which is titled The Reluctant Messiah. But before I read any from that, I'm going to read some poems from my first collection, A Black Odyssey. It'll give you pretty much an idea of where I come from as a poet. One of the things that I do in this is I share my poetic technique, and I'm going to read a section of that later on, and these three poems are perfect illustrations of what I am talking about. This first one is titled Ode to Great Ghosts. I actually have it memorized, but sometimes I'm getting older and sometimes I screw up, so.
Good to back up.
When I gaze into a melancholy sky, one blanketed in gray, the sun a dingy stain in a smoke-sooted ceiling, I fret not the frigid wind, the oblique slash of rain, the gnawing termites at my soul's bones. Neither do I sigh as I watch sad rivers of traffic belch at stoplights, or managers dangling in neckties, egos swaggering, or staggering teenagers jiving on the static of afternoon red-eye. One tear only do I spare for missiles saluting like soldiers, stern, resolute, obedient to push-button orders. Man is a failed crop, pimp-pushing philosophers say. We have known dry winds. We have even orchestrated our own drought. We've known torrents and knocked knees at thunder. And having manufactured thunder, bottled it and dropped it on ourselves, have trembled at our own terribleness. We've spread seed on rock, in blood-soiled mud, along the fertile crescent of madmen, entrepreneurs, salespersons, and prophets. Weathering boredom's drizzle by fanning whims of bearded tyrants, we have carved our scar, etched our initials into history's gushing cheek. We have made more than Jesus weep. Yet, when I think of those who have plowed this dirt before me, who read truth by stars, turned sand into windows, who made rhyme and rhythmed, chiseled truths into stone, who smeared dyes along high-arched ceilings and breathed soul into slaving in the hot sun, billowy, clouded songs. When I recall those who stood in the lighthouse as winds whipped at cobwebbed windows and fog enveloped fast-fading moonglow. What great ghosts haunt these halls? Ghosts named Plato, Socrates. Such great ghosts do haunt these halls, with short names like Homer, Buddha, Dante, and long ones like Michelangelo. Names noble like Napoleon, humble as Jesus, mad as Nietzsche and Van Gogh. Reverent names, Confucius, Lao Tzu, St. Paul. And men and women who left no name at all. But counseled by ghosts breathing in books, dancing from trumpets, quilted in blankets to keep warm what's young, have lifted boulders and turned back floods, have parted rivers and dared the will of pharaohs. When I recall such ghosts, once flesh, once muscle, blood, and bone, whose spit lit candles, whose cries fanned failing embers, rekindling the tearful triumphs that fuel the communal campfire in the black forest of the human soul, I realize Lincoln's, Einstein's, Aristotle's will continue to sprout among us. No cloud ever extinguished sun. Truth shall forever rise from the ashes of fallen angels. Earthquakes shall forever scatter empires mortgaged on greed, hate, and lies. So let the thunderclouds cackle, let the mortars grumble, let the rain rain red. Any second, a deranged Uzi might mow me down on a shopping mall sidewalk. Another brain-splattered blade of grass, mowed, senseless, and dead. Still, grateful, I tumble this raging psychotic sea, bolstered by those ghosts who once plowed this ocean before me. This is a short poem that I dedicate to prophets not honored in their own land. Triangle man, floating among the stars, on what planet will you alight? Who among us could receive your sharp edges? Who could gaze into those pyramid eyes without squaring his jaw or circling her wagons? Isosceles on the mount, with a hypotenuse around your neck, mumbling parables only parallelograms understand. That is your legacy, Triangle Man. You, with your rectangles, must float forever among stars who themselves once had jagged angles, till they found their corner in the universe and caught a fire. Triangle Man, floating among the stars, on what planet will you alight? And this last one, it's titled The Rape, and I'll talk a little later on, read a little about ambiguity. And this is an excellent example of what I mean by ambiguity. She was like God to me, a huge, huge woman with breasts the size of cows and arms as wide as trees. The hair on her arms bristled like pine needles. She smelled of lilacs and evergreen. And when she giggled, laughter and bubbles foamed from her mouth as natural as trout tumbling in a freshwater stream. She was like God to me. I would sit for hours on her pregnant belly and gaze into eyes at once blue and gray and brown and green. I would hike upon her mountainous bosom, roll down her soft brown flesh, make snowmen from her dandruff, and find myself where I had been, not lost, only hidden. She was God, Mary, and Jesus to me. And now she lay in a hospital bed, propped up on pillows while tubes like tentacles pierced her blotched, bruised flesh, her eyes puffed and cut where hours before they bled. They had dragged her to an alley, these ants who call themselves men, whose priest genuflect to books and deeds that read she belongs to them, to do with whatsoever they please. So they nibbled at her flesh, gnawed the back of her neck, drilled for her blood to run their machines, till they flattened her breast, and then fought wars over the right to devour what little was left. Yet she, who was like God to me, smiled, even though to smile was to strain, and she reached to pluck the tear from my cheek, for it was not her fate, but mine she feared. She, who is God to me. So I have a new book out, and it's rather unusual for me. I have a collection of poetry. I have a collection of fiction. This is a hybrid. It is part fiction, part poetry, and part philosophical dialogues. My characters are a group of poets and performers, and they go around the country doing these improvisational performances, which they call the theater of self-emancipation. And my lead character is an African-American poet, semi-successful, and does discussions on philosophy and religion. And so the book follows that. This first poem that I'm going to read is a poem that gets him and the entire group in trouble. It's called Nothing New, the Root of It All. There is nothing new under the sun. Those who fail to learn from history stumble along a forked tongue in the road. The art of the steel, the root of all evil. Lucifer slips another log on the fire, ear cocked to the bully on the pulpit. That little man, thick black mustache, fist pummeling his palm, face orange with fury as he blames Armageddon on liberals, communists, homosexuals. Welcome back. It's Germany circa 1933. Here's a banana for your republic. There is nothing new under the sun. Those who fail to learn, condemned. King Don, the art of the con, putting his cloak of unaccountability on. You reap what you sow. What could possibly go wrong? Philistines storm the castle, picnic on the White House lawn. Yet you find it a hassle to blame the man behind the curtain, certain if you give him a get-out-of-jail-free card, well, what could possibly go wrong? You reap what you sow. There is nothing new under the sun. Not the first time Machiavelli pulled an ace from the middle of the deck to claim the crown, an orange-faced clown mumbling Orwellian doublespeak, brewing a stew that bubbles and hates, confusion and chaos pounding at the gate. Citizens scratch their heads, shrug their shoulders, then ask, what's for dinner? Man does not live by bread alone. Not the first time an emperor with no clothes ordered the rounding up of scapegoats, while his minions humped the golden goose in broad daylight, silk ties to match their tongues, 30 pieces of silver for any who go along. There is nothing new under the sun. Those who fail to learn, condemned to repeat, repeat, repeat. Blame those people over there. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Eliminate any who disagree. Silence your opponents in the name of free speech. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Wash, rinse, spin cycle, repeat. Send in troops when all else fails. And it always fails. Nothing new under the sun. Man does not live by bread alone. Still the belly-aching almighty dollar groans, quid pro quo, leading back to Rome. Caligula stepping out of the closet, Nero twiddling his thumbs, one playing Monopoly, the other Game of Thrones. Deception dawns the judge's robe. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Power corrupts. And absolute power? Ban books from libraries, condemn universities, and any preferring to think for themselves. Ignorance is bliss, easier to dazzle with sleight of hand. Now you see it, now you won't. There is nothing new under the sun. All men are endowed by their Creator. He that toileth, that fat furry cats and belligerent musk rats may soak up the sun. He that beggeth for bread while Marie Antoinette's croon, let them eat cake. Do unto others before they know what hit them. Checks and balances, unbalanced and checked. You reap what you sow. All men are endowed by their Creator. Not the first time corruption grabbed hold of the handlebars, steering the pursuit of happiness towards a precarious cliff, justice with its hands in its pockets, while love of money, the root of it all, rearranges the Supreme Court's docket. You can fool some of the people all of the time, and sometime that's just enough. So as I mentioned, my performers, they go around the country, and the topics they talk about, they examine the world religions, also Western dualism, the good versus evil myth, which I'm going to read a section on you for you, the conservative and liberal viewpoints, the art of poetry, quantum physics, and a number of other things. I'm going to read this first section. As I mentioned, my lead character, Marvin, he's an African-American, and he's, my narrator happens to see him and is struck by him. They make eye contact, and he just decides he has to follow this guy and see what he's about. And so he wanders into a lecture where Marvin is talking about language and what is God. Let me see if I can find the right page here. Do I have it written down? Yes, I do. My take on God, which some of you have previously heard me state, is intricately woven into my understanding of how language works. Indeed, it is the limitations of language that makes the question, what is God, such a landmine. Let me state first, it is important to recognize that words are symbols, which is to say, metaphors. What do I mean by this? Pulling the microphone from its stand, he places it to his chin. He begins to pace the front parameter of the stage, his freehand gestures as he asserts that the word rock is not a rock. You can't throw the word, says. The word rock is a symbol, a metaphor. If we take that object we can throw or skip over water. Communication is pretty straightforward when these symbols called words are used to designate concrete objects. Objects we can see and feel, a rock, a tree, a building. But things start to get sticky when the words, the symbols, the metaphors are used to designate ideas or concepts, things invisible to the naked eye. Words like freedom, justice, racism, even simple words like love, guilt, faith. Have you ever tried to engage in an intelligent conversation over capitalism versus socialism? Most such conversations are doomed to failure. No solid understanding or consensus can be reached. That's because words like capitalism and socialism mean vastly different things to the different people using those same two words. Our individual understandings of capitalism and socialism are oftentimes strikingly different. Thus, we often end up talking apples and oranges. Not only do different people have varying understandings of what these two words mean, but we attach various connotations or associations to those words, depending on our upbringing and personal experiences. As Americans, we've been socialized to despise communism and socialism. Those in socialist and capitalist countries are socialized to despise what their countries call imperial capitalism. My point here is we oftentimes use the same words to mean vastly different things, yet assume we are talking about the same thing. This is why, at least one reason, discussions centered around politics or religion typically break down, sometimes in heated disagreement. And there is no word in the English language that means more different things to more different people than the word God. People begin to rustle in their seats, a few coughing and leaning over to address their neighbors. He begins to assert, that if one were to gather 10 people at random, place them in a room to discuss in great detail their concepts of God, you would not get two identical understandings. The same would be true, he argues, were you to gather 50 people or 100. He suggests our individual concepts of God might be as individual, as subjective as our fingerprints. To get close to what I mean by God, I must first distinguish between two overarching competing concepts of what is called God, at least God as conceived in Christianity. One is a God we can only access through Jesus or by becoming a Christian. One we can only know by embracing Jesus as our personal Savior. This is a God who writes off the overwhelming majority of human beings in favor of one people. Of the billions of people who have populated this planet, past and present, only a select group can have access to this God and benefit from his grace. Contrast this with the concept of God best exemplified, at least for me, by what Jesus called God the Father. The God the Father Jesus spoke of did not care who you were or where you came from. You could be a tax collector, you could be a Gentile, a prostitute, you could even be a Samaritan. It didn't matter. What mattered to this God was two things. First and foremost, how you treat your fellow human being. If you treat other people in the way you yourself wish to be treated, and if you avoid destructive behavior patterns, which is what the sins are all about, you are okay in this God's book no matter who you were. That is a very different understanding of God's nature than the one in which God can only be accessed through Jesus or Moses or Muhammad. Of the two concepts, the one closest to what I attach the word God to is God the Father. In reading the Old Testament, I noticed I could clump the varying understandings of God into one of three categories. The first is a God who embraces all of mankind. The Hebrews, who recognized this God, understood God to be in everyone's lives, that God has an infinite number of ways to reveal his will to each and every breathing human being. That should you, as a Hebrew, encounter, say, someone from China or India or an Aztec or a Mayan, you would not question that God was as much in their lives as in your own. The second understanding of God is a God who only cares about the Jewish people. The rest of humanity could all rot in hell as far as this God is concerned. Canaanites, Assyrians, Babylonians were merely pawns in an elaborate centuries-long game wherein God rewards the Hebrews when they are faithful and severely punishes them every time they stray. The third understanding is a God who for some reason chose to reveal himself first to the Hebrews, then assign the Hebrews the task of spreading that recognition of God to the rest of the world. Ultimately, once everyone came to recognize and embrace that God, there would be peace on earth, all humanity living in harmony and able to re-enter the Garden of Eden, i.e. paradise on earth. Now, you can take this third understanding of God and reconcile it with the first. God is the God of all humanity, and he reveals himself first to the Hebrews, that the Hebrews might spread his word until all of humanity is united in the faith of that one God. You can reconcile this third understanding to the second, that Hebrews are God's favorite people, and by the Hebrews spreading their awareness of God, all humanity would eventually be embraced by God's favor. But you would be hard-pressed to reconcile the first understanding with the second, that God is the God of all humanity, yet God's sole interest in humanity is the Hebrew people. Of these three versions, what I call God comes closest to the first, a God of all humanity, capable of expressing his will, his grace, his presence to every member of the human race. the God the Father Jesus spoke of. I need to state here, he pauses, standing in the middle of the stage. What I call God is not something I believe in. Rather, it is something I recognize. What I call God is ultimately ineffable, which is to say, one can't say precisely what it is. Words don't go there. The best anyone has been able to do is to describe what God is like. That is, assign it an image, that image serving as a symbol or a metaphor for something that ultimately defies language. This is what all religions do. It is what many, many philosophers and thinkers have done, as well as many so-called less educated people who on one level or another recognize something that is universal and omnipresent, yet hard to pin down in concrete everyday language. In the monotheistic religions, the dominant image used is that of an all-knowing human-like conscious being gazing down on us from a place beyond our physical vision. A loving father, for some a Moses-like figure who metes out rewards and punishment according to how we behave. He knows everything, including what we are thinking, so we can't hide anything from him. Sooner or later, we must stand in his judgment, reconcile ourselves to his will. And my character goes on, and he proceeds to show how in the other religions, they use different metaphors, but to get at the same truth. So that's one section that I want to read for you. This next section I want to read is about, I had two reasons for writing this book. One is I wanted to finally define what I had come to recognize as that ineffable thing that I've studied religions and they all recognize. And the other that I wanted to do, excuse me, I've got to soothe my throat here. I wanted to share my poetic technique. So this is a section in which Marvin is talking about his technique for writing poetry. And I mentioned the rape earlier, and I talk about ambiguity. This touches on ambiguity. This is a very short section. He smiles and sips his tea. Hope you enjoy them, he says. Mostly all I do is experiment. One of my favorite quotes from Einstein is, "Genius is the ability to play." That describes perfectly how I write. My great joy in writing is playing with language, experimenting with style and form. Jokingly, I ask if he considers himself a genius. Taking a moment, he responds, "I don't believe genius is something we are, rather something we have. And all of us have it. Some of us are just better at tapping into it than others. Yeah, there's IQ genius, I guess, people born with an unusually high IQ, but there's another kind of genius. I used to consider a couple of friends I performed with geniuses. They were amazing, incredibly talented. Come to learn later, they were both bipolar. While in their manic stage, they managed to tap into something I found awe-inspiring. Audience were blown away as well. I do think I have a so-called genius for how language works, which is to say how the mind internalizes and interprets language. I mainly use sensory imagery, for instance, as opposed to abstract phrasing. Abstract language requires the mind to think. It engages the intellect and requires that intellect to analyze what is being expressed. This can weary the mind much faster than sensory imagery. Sensory and concrete imagery engages sensory memory. With sensory images, we picture or imagine what is being described: a bird soaring, a bell ringing, the smell and sizzle of frying bacon. We then draw associations which bypass intellectual analysis. The mind doesn't analyze, it associates. Thus, it doesn't tire as quickly. My theory is the average listener can only handle about 20 minutes of poetry non-stop. After that, the mind tires, the brain loses concentration and seeks to wander. But with sensory imagery, you can hold a person's attention much longer. Plus, sensory imagery has the added advantage that it suggests rather than states. Instead of telling someone what I want him or her to think, I paint pictures which allow them to decide for themselves what they think or feel about whatever I am describing. This makes them an active participant in the story, which I found is the secret to good storytelling. You provide the reader sensory details they themselves assemble into a coherent narrative. He sips his tea. I also make heavy use of ambiguity. Ambiguity, in fact, is my secret weapon. I use wording and phrasing which suggest multiple things at the same time. Your average reader may only pick up on one of these potential connotations, but they'll gravitate towards a suggestion that best reflects their own personal experience. Thus, they impose their own reality on whatever scenario I am presenting. And if that's not enough, I lull them with the musicality of my language, my use of sound devices, alliteration, assonance, rhyme, slant rhyme, as well as the cadence and varied rhythm of my phrasing. I choose phrasing as much for the sound as for the meaning. Although your average listener may not be consciously aware, each phrase, each image flows easily into the next. Should one image not grab or register its implication, it is quickly followed by another and another, such that the mind will hopefully find enough provocative imagery to remain fully engaged till the end of the performance. That is why, at least why I believe most audience respond so favorably to my performances. So. I am 75 years old now, and I wanted to pass on how I use language. I'm greatly admired for my skill with language, and I did want to share that with other people, so hopefully the art of poetry can continue growing upward rather than downward. I'm going to read one more section from the book. This is a little longer than the others. One of my main themes in this, or I should say one of Marvin's main points, is that human beings tell ourselves these stories, and these stories dictate our beliefs and therefore our actions. And so Marvin is at a story and storytellers convention, and he's on a panel, and this is part of what he expresses. We become the stories we tell ourselves, he begins, glancing around the room, shifting his chair to accommodate the microphone. We tell ourselves these stories in books, in movies, on TV, around the water cooler. Certain stories we tell repeatedly. So repeatedly we come to believe the stories are true. Believing them true, we shape our lives accordingly. We cease to even question the validity of such beliefs. We fail to realize these beliefs are based on fictions we have been telling ourselves. In the 50s and 60s, when I was coming up, the dominant culture told itself the story of black people, people of my color, being inferior to white people, a story it had been telling itself for generations. So ingrained was this belief, no one had to tell me I was inferior. It was something I simply understood. I merely breathed it in like oxygen. I accepted it as an unquestioned fact, as did everyone around me, black and white. I was 16 when I saw through this fiction. In a flash of insight, I realized I was not innately inferior to white people due to my skin color or the blood that ran through my veins. I recognized my situation as what I called an accident of history. I happened to be born at a time within a culture where the white race was on top and blacks on the bottom. I speculated there were probably cultures in other historical periods where blacks were on top and whites at the bottom. And there could very well be future times, countries, and cultures where the table might again be turned. At that time, I concluded this story the dominant culture was telling itself of whites being innately superior to blacks served two purposes for the white race. One, it allowed white people to elevate themselves in their own minds. There is no easier way for a person or a people to elevate themselves than to have someone they can look down on. Black people serve this first function for the white race. I further recognized the story created a near self-fulfilling prophecy. By convincing black people we were inferior, we would be less inclined to make something of ourselves. Why reach for the stars when you are predestined to fall short? Thus, the dominant race had created a situation in which, at least on the surface, blacks did appear inferior to their white counterparts. Our apparent inferiority was a byproduct of the racial superiority story the dominant culture chose to tell itself and us. Growing up, I was fond of TV westerns. In these westerns, the American Indian was often portrayed as a hostile enemy, forever attacking wagon trains and killing decent white people, people on their way to forge a better life. Today, we tell ourselves a different story. We acknowledge what was done to the American Indian was wrong, that this nation fell well short of its democratic, Christian, and humanitarian ideals. We acknowledge we owe the Native American a deep apology. Stories can and do change, but any particular story we repeatedly tell ourselves inevitably begins to dictate our beliefs and, as a consequence, our behavior. We should be cognizant and careful of the stories we choose to repeat. There is another story we tell ourselves repeatedly. We tell it so consistently and so persistently we have ceased to question its validity. As far as most citizens in this culture are concerned, it is an indisputable fact. Yet a close examination will reveal it a mere fiction, a fiction we have convinced ourselves is true. I speak here of the story of good and evil. Originated with the apocryphal literature of Judaism and gaining solid footing in this country's dominant religion and subsequent literature, the good and evil myth is currently trumpeted ad nauseum in our movies and popular fiction, in our daily disputes, and in our way of thinking. Few would question the assumption that there exist these two forces, one called good, the other evil. According to the myth, these two forces are perpetually at war with each other. The forces of good must be forever vigilant, for evil and its proponents, its Darth Vaders, are forever plotting and scheming to rule over us, to oppress all that is innocent, decent, and good. Add to the myth an impending apocalypse, a time projected in the always not too distant future when these two forces will clash in one final cataclysmic battle. But there is a fundamental flaw in this myth. People never see themselves as evil. They only see other people as evil. Evil is what we call someone else, never ourselves. The Ku Klux Klan, when it was lynching, castrating, burning black bodies, dangling from trees, cutting off body parts to keep as souvenirs, did not view themselves or their actions as evil. They viewed the possibility of black men having sex with white men as evil. They viewed black people being treated on equal par with whites as evil. Thus, to rid the South of these evils, the Klan resorted to lynching and terrorizing black people. Acts which we today would consider the epitome of evil, they found perfectly appropriate. The same is true of Nazi Germany. The Nazis did not view themselves as evil. They viewed what they called the Jewish conspiracy as evil. To rid the world of the evil that was the Jew, they came up with the final solution, perfectly logic given the story they were telling themselves. This country did the same with the American Indian. We systematically stole this entire land from the people who rightly owned it. Yet every time they stood up to defend what was rightfully theirs, we labeled them evil savages, giving us the right to hunt them down like dogs and massacre their women and children along the way, all the while believing ourselves good and them evil. We do this now with the people in the Middle East. We brand them evil, giving us the right to bomb and assassinate any of them as we see fit. Were the tables turned and they were bombing and assassinating us, we would consider their behavior the very height of evil. More often than not, evil is what we call someone else to justify doing evil to them. The history of human persecution is overflowing with instances of one people calling another people evil so as to justify horrendous acts of slaughter and oppression. The Inquisitions, witch burnings, the Holocaust, the current war in Gaza, to name only a few. The good and evil myth is a paradigm. It is a way of looking at the world or a given situation, but it is never as the world is. The world, our reality, our experience of being in the world is always far more complex than our limited human understanding of it. There will be situations in which the good versus evil paradigm may prove appropriate. But when applied to a situation where it is inappropriate, which is most cases, the result is nearly always horrific, senseless slaughter and suffering. There is a second, more insidious flaw in the good versus evil myth. Such a view necessitates an adversary. When one subscribes unquestionably to the good and evil myth, one will need an enemy to validate one's worldview. And where there is no enemy, we will create one. In this nation's near 250-year history, most of our adversaries were created by our own attitudes and subsequent actions. The American Indian, Iran, Cuba, North Korea, to name but a few. In most cases, it was the U.S. who threw the first stone. In each case, we resorted calling them evil to deflect our own responsibility in, if not causing the conflict, exacerbating it. Without an enemy, we fight among ourselves, and these battles become very bitter and very personal. Witness our current politics. But give us a common enemy, someone we can mutually hate, ideally fear, and we put aside our differences and join forces to annihilate that enemy. For some people, having an enemy gives purpose to their otherwise mundane lives. At no time will they feel more invigorated, more alive than when confronted with a formidable foe in a life and death existential struggle. Our current obsession with the good and evil paradigm does not bode well for the future of our culture. Is it any wonder there are pockets of our population susceptible to all sorts of conspiracy theories similar to the ones the Nazis used to hoodwink 1930s Germany? We become the stories we tell ourselves. Is it any wonder there are those who are bent on accumulating massive stores of military equipment in anticipation of an impending Armageddon with some government or deep state entity waiting in the sinister wings ready to pounce? As long as we inundate our stories with an endless stream of good versus evil stories, we will convince ourselves the threat of looming evil is real rather than something we project onto those we don't like. So that's my Reluctant Messiah. I can end here. I had one more piece, which isn't that long. The poem that I wrote earlier. Well, in the book, because my characters improvise, most of the poems in there are fragments. Not the poem that I read to you earlier, that is in there, but this is the full poem here, and I wanted to read the second half that's not in part 2. Now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country. Once again, these be the times to try men's souls. You can fool some of the people, but you can never fool them all. Now is the time for all good men, all good women and children of pure hearts to come to the aid of our forefathers who art in heaven. Having brought forth on this continent a new nation of the people, by the people, for the people, in order to form a more perfect union. The arc of the moral universe, though long, bends always towards justice, never just us. Power corrupts, and absolute power inevitably undermines our Father who art in heaven. Man does not live by bread alone, but in doing unto others what you would have them do unto you. Now is the time for all good men to ask, what would love do? A Jesus by any other name. And just who do the proponents of hate thy neighbor who does not think or act as you serve? Lucifer slips another log on the flame. Now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their heart's conscience. The soul that knows the true root of it all is how we choose to treat one another, not who next we can beat down. First they came for immigrants, for the woke, those of Arab descent, transgender youth. How long before they come for you? Divide and conquer. Now comes the time to seek higher ground against that arrogant frown, swearing oaths to a constitution he systematically undermines as loyalty blind whitewashes power's abuse and whatever else his Fox's News can make stick. Due process, rule of law raped by a felon's prick, while the Pontius Pilates in your Senate genuflect. Lucifer toasting marshmallows on the pyre. These are the times that try men's souls, the climate changing, forest on fire, global warming, the money changers deny. Silence is consent to the coming winter of growing discontent as advocates of me first turn their backs on we, the people, to build another biblical steeple, this one of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. There is nothing new under the sun. Man does not live by bread alone. Ask not what your country can do for you, but rather what you can do to obstruct by any means necessary the snake that like hate entices us to forsake our better angels. That goodwill towards men, my country 'tis of thee, and love thy neighbor as thyself, shall not perish from this American earth, but rather have a new birth, or the land of the truly free. That this nation of, by, and for the people shall once again find its moral compass, its true north, and truly let freedom ring. There is nothing new under the sun. We shall forever reap exactly what we sow. Thank you all.
Can I ask a question? You speak a lot of truth, Seth, but you feel very strongly about God the Father. And I want to ask you about God the Father.
No. God the Father, to my mind, that is simply the image that the Christian image takes. If you're talking about the Old opposed to the New Testament, God the Father is, I recognize that. As I said, I've read the Bible several times, and there are certain interpretations of God that I gravitate more towards than other. The first one I gravitated to was Job, that God reveals himself through our suffering, because having grown up black and poor, that's where I really became aware of things going through that. And as I said, God the Father, that's the Christian, the monotheic interpretation of that ineffable thing I'm talking about. I don't have time to go through how I see the Chinese seeing it or how the Hindus see it. But it is in the book. And the quantum physics, I tie that into Eastern thought. There are a lot of parallels between quantum physics and Eastern thought. So, did I answer your question? I think I interrupted you.
We got to wrap it up.
Sorry.
It's fun.